All right, good afternoon, incredible people. It's your favorite motivator from afar, Mike Mallery with a motivational jumpstart right here on WHUS Stores 91.7 FM. This is a special broadcast. I'm very excited to be in studio. It's a personal feat for me right now because in studio I have a person who's not a stranger to the studio, the legend Dr. Joseph Cooper, my advisor, my mentor in the world of academia and just mentor in life. And I'm so excited because there's been a lot of things that have been happening in the world of sports, as we know over the past week. You know, from President Trump's comments, explosive comments or not so explosive comments. But I had to ask Dr. Cooper to come in studio to not only talk a little bit more about this, to shed light on his thought-provoking ideology behind it, and just build from there. So without further ado, in studio we have Dr. Joseph Cooper. How you doing, sir?
Hey, good morning. Good morning. Good morning, everybody. Appreciate it. The opportunity to be on here once again, and definitely we got quite a bit to talk about for sure.
Absolutely. So, Dr. Cooper, we're just going to get right into it. So, obviously, we know as it relates to the NFL, the protests, all these different things that are happening. Mm-hmm. It's mind-boggling to me that this is even really a discussion. Mm-hmm. But, you know, what are your thoughts on it? Just kind of taking the listeners back, those who might not be too informed, you know, with the whole silent protest and thing that started with, you know, predating Colin Kaepernick, right, but more recently Colin Kaepernick. Sure. And then we're going to build from there. What are your thoughts, your emotions, and then that's going to catapult us into the past weekend and the rhetoric that's been surrounding it.
Yeah, I think the norm in our society is that sports, this is the narrative that's been promoted by those who've organized sport, which is in conjunction with the organization of our other social institutions. That includes education, business, politics, healthcare, you name it, is that sport is intended to be apolitical. Mm-hmm. It's a spot where we all come together. It's supposed to be this utopia. And no doubt there are many positive benefits that come from sport. You see communities come together in ways that nothing else in that community has brought it together other than sport. You see some families experience upward mobility by virtue of being involved in sport. You've seen sport bring people from different racial backgrounds, different religious backgrounds, different sexual identity backgrounds together. Right. But that does not negate the reality that sport, like our other social institutions, oftentimes reinforces and reflects broader inequalities in our society. For example, the NFL, 70% black male, 0% ownership. That's not by accident, that's by design. Mm-hmm. So when you see a situation like Colin Kaepernick taking a knee to draw attention to widespread injustices in society, he became a part of a larger legacy of black athlete activists who decided to use sport as a platform to speak to broader issues. It's this idea that, yes, I'm an athlete, but I'm also a black man, I'm a concerned citizen, and I care about these issues, so I'm going to use this platform to draw attention to them. Now, the general sport populace doesn't like to see that. The owners definitely don't like to see that, because what that does is it spotlights some of the ways in which their everyday practices perpetuate the inequalities that we see in society. You've got these NFL teams that are located in these major cities all across the country, Baltimore, D.C., Philadelphia, Chicago. And you've got these the NFL is a multi-billion-dollar industry. These NFL teams generate millions of dollars every year. Tax dollars go to them. Owners reap most of the benefits. Yes, the athletes get paid based on their collective bargaining agreement. But what about the issues going on in the south side of Chicago? What is the Chicago Bears ownership and role doing to improve that? And I'm not talking about individual athletes, right? So when you start to think about these institutions economically benefit of our society, but what are they giving back to us besides feel-good memories, highlights, and you know, giving us access to world-class athletes? So for me, the most recent demonstrations, and I don't call them protests. See, I think that's an important distinction we need to make. What Colin Kaepernick did was a symbolic act of activism. He disrupted the social order to draw attention to inequalities in the broader society. What the football players did this past weekend with the owners, whenever you see a group that is typically a part of doing the oppression participate in a particular act, you have to ask yourself, well, why are they doing that? Because the owners, remember, right after Kaepernick took his initial knee, almost all of the owners, I don't even think there was one who came out in support of Kaepernick.
Absolutely.
There was widespread criticism saying that, well, we're not picking him up because of his playing abilities, and this isn't the appropriate place to do it. And I always find it interesting, the people who are not being oppressed feel that they have the right to tell another group of people how they should protest, right? Like, no, I'm going to oppress you, but you can only protest me in this way. I find that very patronizing and very problematic. And it was a silent protest, right? We think about the situation that was going on in Baltimore after the death of Freddie Gray. There were people peacefully marching in the street. They had an issue with that. They had people who were knocking down some of the local businesses out of frustration, right? And when you have that kind of rage and anger, it's going to come out in some way, right? So they said that wasn't okay. You have Colin Kaepernick taking a knee during a time where there's no NFL policy that requires them to stand for the national anthem. There's no federal law that requires you to, or state law that requires you to stand for the national anthem. And it's a peaceful protest. It's not disrupting the game. He didn't ask the camera to be put on him, right? And so the media knows what they're doing when they put it on him in that way. So he used his platform. After the games, he explained exactly, in detail, this is why I am taking a knee. So now what the media has done is said, okay, he's disrespecting the American flag. He's disrespecting the military. Nothing about his initial act of activism and protest was about the military at all. Mm-hmm. And that's the problem, that we have different groups who like to co-opt a narrative or project their narrative on a larger context. People say the flag means to me the military. The flag means to me ancestors. Well, I say, all right, me as a black person, what did the flag means to me when the Constitution was signed? We were 3/5 of a human being. Right. The flag means to me that I've been viewed as property for the majority of the time this country's been in existence. For the flag, to me, it means Trayvon Martin can be killed and George Zimmerman can get off. Right? For the flag, to me, it means we can have a video of Eric Gardner being choked by 5 police officers and none of those officers get convicted. Right. When the flag, to me, means Dylan Roof can go and shoot up a church of black people in Charleston, South Carolina, and he gets detained without being killed. So this person had guns. You know that the murder was done. And then you got innocent black people being killed with no guns, threatening nobody. Right? That's what the American flag means to us. And then when we look at our educational system, we look at our communities, not to mention, so we haven't gotten the reparations back from when we were enslaved. So the billions and trillions of dollars worth of wealth that this country has possessed is primarily because of us, African Americans. There's no argument about that. But there seems to be no discussion about why now we want to talk about achievement gap, which is not an achievement gap. It's a conditions gap, right? Mm-hmm. It's a situation where you've reallocated resources unjustly, which we don't. It seems like we always want to dodge that part of the conversation. So it's always about personal responsibility and let's just work with what we have. And it's like, well, if you constantly are stripping people of certain resources, if you're constantly exploiting them, and then you're asking, well, just do the best you can, what other group of people, any group of people, would not be struggling under those conditions? Mm-hmm. And that's all Colin Kaepernick was drawing attention to. Now, what the football players and the owners this weekend were doing, they realize their ratings are lower. Mm-hmm. They realize there's a wider public sentiment based on the president's recent comments that are saying that you don't want to be associated with this president, even if you're a multi-billion-dollar football owner, because there's a large population of the American citizenship that says, hey, we're not going to put our dollars into this if you're going to blatantly continue to support this. So for many of those players, it was a matter of, I didn't like what the president said. For the owners, it was strictly economical. It's about their self-interest. That had nothing to do with what Colin Kaepernick was taking a knee about, has nothing to do with improving the plight of black and Latino people in this country, has nothing to do with helping poor people across all racial backgrounds. And that's my issue, is that people are labeling what they did as a protest. Mm-hmm. They did not engage in a protest. What Colin Kaepernick did was a protest. What Michael Bennett has been doing is a protest. What Tommy Smith and John Carlos did in the 1968 Olympics was a protest. Mm-hmm. What Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf did in the 90s when he was in the NBA, when he refused to salute the flag, was a protest. So let's not conflate the actions, even though the gesture is the same. You can't take away the context from which the gesture took place. Now, if all of those players did it in concert right when Colin Kaepernick did it, which is what I think all of them should have done, especially given that 70% of the NFL is black males, and other than Michael Bennett, Doug Baldwin, and a few others, Marshawn Lynch, there's not a widespread outward support for Colin Kaepernick, which is very telling to me. to me, you got to get to the question of, I understand you have an economic incentive to kind of go along with the norm as it's currently situated. But you got to ask yourself, what means more to you? If you're more loyal to a white-owned organization that's exploiting our people, right, and making millions of dollars from fans of all racial groups, even though the communities in which they're located in are very close to, are still economically strapped, right? I mean, are you more, that means more to you than standing up for the fight of your people. Colin Kaepernick knew very well. He was working with Dr. Harry Edwards, who organized the Olympic Project for Human Rights when Tommy Smith and John Carlos raised their black fist. He was the founder of sports sociology. He had been in conversations with Dr. Harry Edwards prior to when he engaged in that activist act of taking a knee. So that tells me he's been doing his homework, he's been educated, and he's got a level of consciousness and conviction to say that there's some things that are worth more than an NFL paycheck. There's some things that are worth more than an NFL career. He would love to play, but he's not going to play at the expense of having his First Amendment rights or having his right to peacefully protest be stripped away from him. And you can see with his I Know My Rights, I Know Your Rights campaign and the various money he's been given to Somalia, Oakland, all over the world. He's been engaged in this type of activism and social justice work overall. What I would like to see is economic activism, to me, is the real black power salute. And these black athletes have a tremendous amount of power to leverage that influence. And I'm not just talking about from a players union standpoint. I'm trying to say that all of these talented black athletes, if they really want the NFL, if they want society to listen to the grievances of those who are affected in many of these communities, which they are connected to these communities, take a stand. And what I mean by take a stand, say we're not going to play. Say until you reinstate Colin Kaepernick and address this overt discrimination, not one of us is going to play. Matter of fact, let's have a conversation about starting our own leagues. It seems that it's comfortable as long as white owners own their own teams, circa the Negro leagues in the 1920s through the 1940s. All of a sudden, it's like, oh, that's racist. That's not, why would you want to segregate like that? You don't think the current situation is racist? You don't think the fact that there's not one black owner in the NFL, even though majority of the players are black, is racist? You don't think that the fact there's only one black owner in the NBA, when the majority of those black players are black, right? Like what I told my students all the time, I said, what if NHL hockey had all black owners? And you look at the current racial composition of the players, what would you say? And my students are like, whoa, Dr. Cooper, that's black people don't play hockey. Like, that wouldn't make sense. I'm like, well, a lot of these owners didn't play football, right? A lot of these owners aren't fueling this industry in that way. They're operating from an economic power position, but I argue that the black athletes have an extremely strong economic power position. What is lacking is the social political consciousness. What is lacking is the conviction and the courage to activate that power that they have to improve the conditions of our people. So I know that was a long answer, but obviously this instance happened last weekend. It's something that I'm very passionate about. I've been thinking about. Absolutely. And I just, it's frustrating when I see people take the demonstrations this weekend out of context. They try to say the demonstrations were the same as what Colin Kaepernick. The reasons for the reason for the demonstrations this weekend were not the same as the reason why Colin Kaepernick took a knee. The impact of those this past weekend wasn't the same as the impact of Colin Kaepernick taking a knee. So don't classify those two things in the same regard, even if the gesture looks the same. It's not the same.
Wow. No, I mean, that's powerful. I mean, I can't argue with that even a fraction of it. Is something I'm passionate about as well. So within just taking a quick step back, but tying in all of those amazing points that you made, you know, I think some of the points that people are missing. So just historically, who decided, outside of the dominant population, right, that the flag was that kneeling down, when we know kneeling, whether it's in church or it's in any different institutions, kneeling is a sign of respect, right? Although Colin Kaepernick decided to do, you know, choose his form of protesting in that way, his back wasn't to the flag, right? I think after the media strategically, you know, aired the clip and turned this into something, you know, very targeted. There was this movement on Twitter and just around the world from veteran support cap. So you had military veterans who came out. No, this is what we out here in these different countries fighting for to retain this right to do this. Yeah. So even within military support and all of these other, you know, variation and factors that people are missing, you know, how do you feel as though, within the antics that just happened.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was a powerful statement you said. When anytime you see the individuals who are doing the oppression, taking a knee, something is fishy about that. Yeah. Something is fishy about it. So just expand a little bit more just on that, from the military support that has been for Colin Kaepernick, and then the ultimate big agenda that you think is really happening right now with the targeted media. Like, what's the big play?
Yeah, I mean, I think for one, we have a very the primary narrative. So I don't use the term dominant narrative. A lot of times in our society, we'll say like the dominant culture, the dominant narrative. And I think when we use those type of terms, although we're trying to accurately describe the difference in power relationships, oftentimes we're reinforcing notions of innate inferiority and superiority, which I think are socially constructed. Yeah. But I think what you're talking about, it gets at the heart at who gets to define what's considered patriotic. For example, Muhammad Ali in 1967, when he decided to decline his draft into the military, he was very outspoken saying, I don't see the logic in me going over to Vietnam to kill other brown people when I know here in the United States there is widespread discrimination, racism, oppression, marginalization, exploitation happening to black people here right now.
Right.
Like, I don't understand why. So now all of a sudden he becomes unpatriotic. At that time, Muhammad Ali was highly scrutinized, highly criticized across the United States. Even within the black community, he was criticized. Retrospectively, in the 1996 Olympics, they have him carrying the torch in Atlanta, and we celebrate him. Right? And now he's romanticized as this American folk hero. So to me, I have a hard time understanding, like, how do we view Colin Kaepernick in the way we do today, and we view Muhammad Ali as a hero? Because essentially, Colin Kaepernick is doing what Muhammad Ali would do had he been alive right now.
Absolutely.
Right? So I think it's this idea of, if we challenge the idea of what does it mean to be patriotic, what does nationalism mean, somehow we're un-American, we're anti-American. And I would say, and James Baldwin has said this in his work, is this idea that because I love America, and I think African Americans, in terms of having rights in this country, we deserve as much, if not more, than any other group because of what has been done to us on this soil, right? And not excluding indigenous people as well. And so this idea to criticize and to ask America to be a better version of itself, this idea to highlight that everybody wants to talk about the best country in the world, I think the question has to become, from what perspective are you speaking from? Right. If you're in a privileged position where America has been great to you, yeah, you're going to think that. But if I just lost my son or daughter, or if I'm constantly being denied employment access and I'm living in poverty, I'm not so sure that I'm going to have that same sentiment. Even if you tell me that in other parts of the world things are worse. That is definitely true. But there are also other parts of the world where things aren't as bad as they are here. I think we got to get out of this idea of American exceptionalism and have a more honest reflection about what are the benefits and the pros of our country, but what are the areas where we have a long way to go. And the core issue that we haven't dealt with in this country is the issue of racism, right? I mean, we've had this idea we systemically oppressed a group of people. Mm-hmm. We've never given reparations. We've done kind of piecemeal reforms, and then we act like, well, why aren't things getting better? Right? Like, it's like, well, why don't you think this thing's getting... It wasn't naturally this way. Like, you have to understand, like, exactly what was done, what is continuing to be done in order for it to be maintained this way. So getting back to your point about the American flag and saluting it, one question has to be, what is the purpose of having people... Because, for example, they say Colin Kaepernick's disrespectful if he kneels. They say some people are disrespectful when they turn their back. I find that very racist to me. And the reason why I say racist, because if you were to pan a camera across a stadium when the national anthem is playing, and you see several white people in the audience drinking beers, hats on their phone, you know what I mean? Like, doing things that aren't acknowledging this quote-unquote solemn moment. Yeah. So I think that you're selectively targeting a particular individual, saying that they're not being patriotic. When you look at, like, is everybody else in this space doing it? Are you going to criticize everybody else? No, because that's not the target of who you're trying to oppress. You're trying to create a narrative of this deviant black male, which fits a larger narrative that you're trying to promote in our society, which would justify the continued mass incarceration of black males, the continued mass putting black males in special education, suspending them and expelling them from schools. So the media and the people in these positions, whether implicitly or explicitly, whether subconsciously or consciously, are engaging in acts that are very dangerous and very problematic. Mm-hmm. The other piece is, I don't think the NFL, I know they have a strong relationship with the military, but it hasn't been long-standing that, or at least it hasn't been since the beginning, this idea of teams standing out for the national anthem. I feel like it had to be around 2009, 2005, around that era where it became more normalized that teams would actually be out on the field for the national anthem. I know at many of our public educational institutions for sport matches, they have that. But if you go to private schools, if you go to many, whether it's a private club, sporting event, you don't see this national anthem being played. The other piece that I want to bring out that Colin Kaepernick brought up is, can we please revisit who wrote the national anthem? Mm-hmm. Let's watch and read the entire lyrics of the national anthem. Absolutely. And let's say, is this something that reflects what all of us as Americans should uphold? Because I don't think so. I really don't think so. If you do your research on Francis Scott Keys, if you look at the third stanza of the Star Spangled Banner, it's not something that I think any black person would be saluting. They're putting a hand over their heart for. Right? And so that's where I think as a country, like, let's get to the core issue. Let's not just let's not question, let's just salute it because it's the national anthem and we should all have an idea of what this means. But what if it doesn't mean it? Like, what actually does the Star Spangled Banner mean? Mm-hmm. Let's break it down. We have enough historians, social studies teachers, people who are well-versed in the history of this country. Let's talk about it. What really does it mean? And is this something that we should uphold? There's a reason why for black Americans, African Americans, we call our Negro national anthem Lift Every Voice and Sing. Yeah. If you read the lyrics of that song, you see why we advocate and salute that, right? Like, it speaks to an experience that we've had. It speaks to this notion of enduring pain and triumph and uplift. It doesn't talk about killing people who were enslaved, right? Which the third stanza, if you read of the entire Star Spangled Banner, there is a statement about, and those slaves, right? And so that was in the actual song. Uh-huh. And we're arguing about whether we should honor the military or honor this song, and we're not even getting to what does this song really mean? Why do we continue to sing this song? Mm-hmm. Just like the recent conversations around taking down Confederate monuments. Prior to recently, now there are several people who've been advocating for removing the Confederate flags and the monuments for years. But the widespread popular opinion was, well, this is the name of the school, Thomas Jefferson School, Robert E. Lee. But it's like, can we have a critical conversation of what did Robert E. Lee represent? Why should I, as an African American, be okay with a statue in my city representing what he represented?
Right.
Why would I be okay with that? Right? And whenever I say that, people are kind of like, I kind of get it. But then when I say, and multiple people are giving this example, would you say to Jews living in Germany, let's have statues of Hitler and all Nazi soldiers and name schools after Nazis? All of a sudden, people are like, yeah, that's bad. So why is the Jew example analogy more humanistic, but the African-American plight in the United States, why is that not humanistic? Like, that's what bothers me. Like, when you give the Nazi example, people have a very strong bad. But when you talk about slavery in the United States against African-Americans, it's like a contested debate. Yeah, it's about like the Black Lives Matter. There's a debate. So the whole Black Lives Matter is about expressing our desire to live freely, free from violence, free from judgment, free from oppression. That's all Black Lives Matter is saying. Now, similar to the whole Kaepernick knee in the flag, it's getting misconstrued as it's about, oh, well, other lives don't matter. If you're not black, you don't matter. This is a racist organization. So I'm like, so if you say white lives matter, people be like, all right. You say Jews lives matter, all right. You say any other group lives matter, okay. But when you say Black Lives Matter, we have to debate whether we can even legitimately say it. Therein lies the problem, right? Like, we are talking about our lives, and now you're contesting us for even talking about our lives matter. When I say Black Lives Matter, I'm offended at Confederate statues, but you didn't seem to care about that. I'm offended at young black brothers getting killed without people being held accountable, but you don't seem offended by that. But if I take a knee, no, don't do that. If I say Black Lives Matter, no, don't do that. So you got to think to yourself, what are we mad about? What is the cause of our response? And then what are you mad about? Mm-hmm. You're mad about how I'm doing it. Mm-hmm. You're mad that I'm making you uncomfortable. We're mad about our lives being taken. Absolutely. We're mad about not having adequate resources. We're mad about not having an honest conversation about things that we are supposed to have unquestioned loyalty to that have been symbols of oppression to us. That's what we are mad about. So let's talk about that as opposed to you just being uncomfortable or you kind of making it about you, right? If you want to talk about other issues that pertain to different groups, we can definitely talk about them. Mm-hmm. But at some point, let's shift the conversation to these issues and have an honest conversation about it.
Absolutely. Man, Brother Cooper, Dr. Cooper, you are definitely hitting on so many powerful points that I think from the critical consciousness that we already know it's not embedded in American society, not embedded within K through 12 schools holistically. So people to even fathom and rationalize with that idea, and I think you nailed it. Oh, it's because I'm making you uncomfortable. And the mere fact that, within these societal norms, I don't want to be comfortable. I should be able to feel the way that I want. So I think that's powerful. So for the essence of time, I just have you said something that was so thought-provoking, and we're going to definitely touch on it another time. But if you can just really hit harp one more time, I think I heard you say something that economic activism is the real Black Power solution. Can you just harp on that for the remaining 5-10 minutes? Just really. When do you think, because, especially in NFL, NBA, when we just look at just ultimately, right, white ownership is getting our quote-unquote elite athletes between 18 and, 25, right? So historically, unfortunately, because going through, the American school system, the level of consciousness, self-identity, all these things that represent Black ancestry and our historical reference points is not taught, right? So knowing that they're getting these individuals at the highest athletic talent, and most of their windows are between 18 and 25, how do we get that level of consciousness for them to say, no, my economic activism is the real Black Power salute?
Yeah, I mean, I think, obviously you're a part of a group we have here called Collective Uplift. It's a holistic development support group designed to enhance consciousness, empowerment, and stimulate counteraction. And I think, to your point, I think more young Black athletes in sport organizations, anybody involved in youth sports, particularly if it involves Black athletes, has to take the responsibility of educating our Black youth about the history of our involvement in sport. And I'm talking about taking it back to the 1800s with Moses Fleetwood Walker, at the turn of the century with Jack Johnson, talking about Joe Louis and Jesse Owens, talking about the Black activist athletes during the Civil Rights Movement, including Muhammad Ali, Bill Russell, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. Then we have to talk about the post-civil rights era where you had O.J. Simpson, Michael Jordan. I'm not calling them activists, but I'm saying the plight, the journey of the Black athlete. There's a scholar, David Wiggins, who's written extensively on it. And obviously Dr. Harry Edwards. And I think if we can just educate, because prior to the 1970s, really between 1950s and 1970s, you saw the widespread shift of Black athletes being assimilated into professional sports, white-controlled professional sports, as well as historically white institutions, which now are multi-billion-dollar generating industries with March Madness tournament, men's basketball March Madness tournament, and the college football playoff and the bowl games. But before that point, all of these talented Black athletes, vast majority of them, were going to historically Black colleges and universities, and we were thriving. Right, you had Grambling State, you had Morgan State, you had all of these HBCUs that were thriving. Similarly, we talk about Black Wall Street, and we talk about the economic vitality that was thrived there because there was a commitment to cultural and racial uplift. So I think what we have to do is first educate our young people about the history of our people. We have to really teach them to love and respect one another, even in a society that doesn't love and respect us. Because I think what it is that we have a lot of internalized self-disdain or self-hate towards one another. So like if you go into a store and you see a sister who's running, let's say or you go into a building, you've got a sister who has her own dentist operation, her dentistry business, and you see a white dentistry business. Most Black people, just from being socialized to think, well, that white one will probably give me better service, right? You don't know anything about their background. You don't know about their training. You don't know about anything, but you've been socially programmed to view that as better. And we have to start to unlearn that. It's kind of Carter G. Woodson, The Miseducation of the Negro. Gives an example about if you socialize a group of people to go to the back door, after a certain period of time, you won't have to tell them to go to the back door. By their conditioning, they're automatically going to go there. So what I'm saying is let's condition the opposite. Let's condition us to say that, okay, LeBron, let's say all these talented athletes, why don't we have our own? Like, why do you really need Nike, though? Do you really need Nike? I would argue at this point, if LeBron said, look, I don't want to have Nike anymore, I'm going to build on what LeVar Ball said. I'm going to figure out how to build my own shoe. my own merchandise. We could do it. You're going to have some of these athletes who are going to talk to younger athletes and say, why don't you go to HBCUs, right? The amount, if you're that talented, more than likely you're going to get looked at anyway, right? You're going to get drafted or have professional opportunities in the U.S. or abroad anyway. Why don't we start going to institutions that were intended to build for our collective uplift as a community? So I think it's just opening up the imagination and the possibility. Right now, we're so conditioned to the norm. It's like, I got to go D1. And D1 doesn't mean the MEAC or the SWAC conference, right? D1 means I got to go to a Kentucky. I got to go to a UConn. I got to go to a North Carolina, UCLA. And it's like, while you're there, they're making money off of you. So unless you're truly investing in your holistic education, or unless you get enough out of the basketball arrangement, which very few of us actually get, and I'm talking about making it to the professional ranks, what have you gotten out of that situation? They definitely cashed in off of you, right? And they're doing it systematically. And I think just heightening that critical consciousness, if you educate people about where we've come from, help them unlearn the idea that investing in your own people is not a bad thing, and it's not racist to do so. Every group does it all the time. We don't call them racist, right? I mean, I'm just mind blown that the current arrangement of the NFL, NBA, and big time college sports, you know, aside from those people who feel like this is definitely a problematic arrangement, a vast majority of us are just like, this is business as usual. But if the racial roles were reversed, people would be going crazy. They'd be like, there's no way you've got 70% white athletes in this sport and it's all black owners, right? Like, there's no way that you've got over 60% of the major big-time college basketball programs are white and you got all black coaches, right, who are making millions of dollars, or majority black coaches making millions of dollars, and black schools overseeing them making millions of dollars. Like, people would go crazy. But if it's the current situation, we're just like, well, it is what it is. So I think it's the education piece. It's the socialization around loving yourself, loving people who look like you, and it's about that collective commitment. So, I mean, it's the education, the socialization, and commitment. If we do those things among young black athletes, I do think we'll see a major shift in our culture. But it takes a consciousness of what is being done to us. Right? Like, you can't just go through the world and say that, okay, if I watch a commercial on Gatorade, etc., I'm going to be reinforced with what I should be doing. All they're going to do is convince you or distract you to do what's going to benefit the status quo. So you got to consciously consume content that's helping you to think in a broader way about our existence in this space and the possibilities for our empowerment moving forward. But I feel like every Saturdays you can go to any Pop Warner League and see us there in numbers. You can go to any AAU tournament and see us there in numbers. So we've got the appeal. We've got the economic drive to do it. We just need to redirect why we're doing it and who we're doing it with and who we're doing it for.
Man, listen, Dr. Cooper, man, for that's the time. I appreciate that. To the listeners out there, the playback is going to be. This is why I'm working with this guy, people, because of the level, the intellectual savviness, you know, just real true passion, you know, for this topic and area. In a very holistic manner, and trying to inspire the next generation of athletes to just think critically, to have the world think critically about a lot of these issues that are continuing to marginalize and disenfranchise athletes and people of color across the country. So, Dr. Cooper, I appreciate you for coming.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate being on here. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So we're gonna have a part 2. I know the feedback that I'm gonna get is gonna be explosive, and we encourage the explosiveness because at the end of the day, you know, we deal with facts and we deal with certain perspectives that, from a historical context, you can't really dispute history. Those things are well documented. So for the motivational jumpstart, until next time.